Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the ceiling. The weight of exhaustion pressed against his chest, heavier than ever before. He used to believe in something, God, fate, divine purpose, but those days felt like a distant memory. Life had been relentless, stripping him of every ounce of faith he once carried. He used to pray. Every night, without fail, he'd clasp his hands together, whispering words of gratitude and hope. But that was before the layoffs, before his mother got sick, before the accident, before he watched everything he built crumble right in front of him. If God was real, Daniel figured, he wasn't listening. Now, prayer felt like a cruel joke, an empty habit meant for desperate people who still believed someone up there was paying attention. Daniel had stopped believing. The struggles had started small, missed bills, a slow dip in his savings, work stress, but they had snowballed into something he couldn't escape. The company he had worked for shut down, leaving him unemployed. His mother's health declined and medical bills stacked up like an impossible wall. And then came the car accident. A reckless driver, a shattered leg, months of painful recovery, and a growing pile of debt. He had no one to turn to. Friends distanced themselves, his relationships suffered, and he was drowning in the loneliness of it all. One evening, after yet another rejection email from a job he was overqualified for, he stared at the eviction notice on his door. He let out a bitter laugh. "What kind of God lets this happen?" he muttered. With a sigh, he grabbed his coat and left his apartment. He had no real destination, just the need to escape his suffocating reality. Daniel wandered into an old part of town, his mind clouded with hopelessness. As he walked, he passed by a small, worn-down church, one he hadn't noticed before. The doors were slightly open, light spilling onto the sidewalk. Something about it made him pause. He wasn't sure why, but he stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the silence was almost deafening. An elderly priest stood near the altar, adjusting a row of candles. He looked up, eyes kind yet knowing. "Lost your way, son?" the priest asked. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "I lost it a long time ago." The priest nodded as if he had heard those words before. Faith isn't about never questioning, Daniel. It's about finding your way back when the world shakes you. Daniel frowned. "How do you know my name?" The priest smiled but said nothing. The challenge that changed everything. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. "Daniel, it's the hospital. Your mother took a turn for the worse last night. You should come." The world tilted. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out, his mind racing. When he arrived, his mother looked frail, her skin pale against the hospital sheets. He sat beside her, gripping her hand. "Mom, I'm here," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, a small, tired smile appearing. "You always were, sweetheart. Even when you thought you weren't." Tears welled in his eyes. He had been so lost in his own pain that he hadn't realized how much she needed him. The doctor came in with grim news. "Her body is failing, Daniel. It's time to prepare for the worst." Daniel felt the walls closing in. He had already lost so much. He couldn't lose her too. That night, as he sat in the dim hospital room, something inside him cracked. He hadn't prayed in years, but now, with nowhere else to turn, he clasped his hands together. "Please," he whispered. "I don't know if you're still listening, if you ever were, but if you are, don't take her yet." His voice broke, and for the first time in years, he let himself cry, not out of frustration, but out of surrender. The next morning, a nurse rushed in, surprise written all over her face. "Daniel, we need to talk." He braced himself for the worst. "Your mother, she made it through the night. Her vitals are stabilizing. We don't know how, but whatever it was, it's a miracle." The word miracle felt foreign in his mind, but as he looked at his mother, her breathing stronger, her eyes brighter, he knew something had changed. Something inside him had changed. Weeks passed, and his mother's health continued to improve. Daniel found himself returning to the small church he had stumbled into that night. The priest was there again, waiting. "Back so soon?" he asked, smiling. Daniel exhaled. "I don't know what I believe anymore, but I think I want to try again." The priest nodded. "Faith isn't about never doubting, Daniel. It's about holding on, even when everything in you wants to let go." Daniel sat down in the pew, letting the silence wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Maybe he hadn't been abandoned. Maybe he had just been too lost in his pain to see the path in front of him. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't walking it alone. Moral of the story: faith is not about never questioning or never falling. It's about finding your way back when life shakes you to your core. Even in your darkest moments, you are never truly alone. Sometimes, faith is simply a whisper in the dark, a quiet surrender, a choice to believe even when everything seems lost. Because when you open your heart, even just a little, hope has a way of finding its way back in.